Jinendra. I welcome you all to this online monthly lecture series in Jainism. This is the 12th lecture in the series and the first of the year. And the topic itself is so interesting. It's between history and memory, the Sultans of Delhi in Jain literature. And today, to present this talk, we have with us Dr. Stephen Vose from Denver. And to preside this session, we have Dr. Ashok Kumar Singh with us from ISJS Pune. To welcome you all formally, we will do the welcome later on. First, I would request our BMTF participant, Prakrit Fellowship Program participant, Anahita Hoos, to recite Manglacharan and another verse which she has prepared. Anahita.
Namo Arihantanam, Namo Siddhanam, Namo Ariyanam, Namo Uvajjayanam, Namo Loe Savasahunam, Mokshamargasya Netaram, Bhetaram Karma Bhubhartam, Nyataram Vishvatattvanam, Vande Taggunalabdhaye, Vande Taggunalabdhaye.
Thank you so much, Anahita. That was really sweet. And now we have all of you over here. To welcome you all formally, I would request Dr. Srinedra Pandey, our director of the organization, to say a few words.
Namaskar, Jai Jinendra. I welcome you all to the 12th lecture under the monthly lecture series by International School for Jain Studies. You all are aware with the topic of today's talk between history and memory, the Sultans of Delhi in Jain literature. And I feel proud to say that to deliver the subject, we have invited our own Professor Stephen Vose. So Professor Vose, behalf of myself, behalf of ISJS, I welcome you to this virtual platform of ISJS. To preside the session, we have Professor Ashok Kumar Singh ji with us, who is here with us for last 2.5 years. And he is our project in charge for Prakrit projects. So, behalf of myself, I welcome our own Professor Ashok Kumar Singh ji. I would like to welcome our President, Dr. Sugan Jain, our advisors, Dr. Jaswant Modi ji, Dr. Sulekh Chand Jain ji, Sri Narendra Parsan ji. Sir, I welcome you all to this monthly online lecture series. I can say many scholars from the various parts of the globe. Professor John Eckhart is here. Sir, I welcome you to this monthly lecture series. I welcome our academic advisor, Professor Prakash Chand Jain ji. I welcome Professor Srikant Gadvir, coordinator, Bhagwan Seetal Nath Jain Chair for Archaeology at Deccan College Postgraduate Research Institute. I welcome Sunita Median, Professor Sunita Median, who has joined here from Georgia College and State University. I can show so many scholars, Professor Mercy Helen and many other scholars who are joining here from the various parts of the globe. I welcome you all from behalf of myself and behalf of International School for Jain Studies. As Pragyaji told, that this is the 12th lecture under the series. Last year, in the month of February, we had started this monthly lecture series under the supervision of our president and chairman and our academic advisors. And during this 1 year period, our speakers have covered the various aspects of Jainology like philosophy, ethics, rituals, and applications. Even one lecture was delivered on Jain mendicants who went outside South Asia. So Professor Jeffrey DeLong was the inaugural speaker, and we are fortunate to have Professor Jain Vose, Professor Jain. So various scholars from the different part of the globe have delivered distinguished talks on the virtual platform of ISJS. And today we are going to listen a very special talk on between history and memory, the Sultans of Delhi Jain literature. So once again, I welcome you all. Namaskar, Jai. Over to you, Pragya.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. And in the awe of this August gathering with us, and with the permission of the chair, I would request Dr. Vose to begin this talk.
Thank you very much, Pragyaji and Professor Ashok and Professor Pandey. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this August lecture series. And without further ado, I will get started. Hope you all can see my presentation here.
Yes.
So this presentation is a synopsis of my forthcoming book, which should be out this spring, called Reimagining Jainism in Islamic India, Jain Intellectual Culture in the Delhi Sultanate. And it will be out on Routledge Press. And I've recently started giving a number of talks in sort of the lead up to the publication of the book. And the last time I gave a talk on this, one of the questions that I got was kind of about why I got into this project. Certainly, when we think of writing the history of Jains and Jainism, the Delhi Sultanate does not immediately come to mind. But what I find so interesting about this period is that this was a period of major political transition, and because of that, also social and cultural transition. And Jains were certainly not exempt from working their way through what this transition was going to mean for them. But as a historian, I think that what has really started to mean so much to me about this project was really summed up well in the words of Walter Benjamin, who wrote a fantastic little essay called On the Concept of History, in which he presents a series of vignettes. And just to read this to you, I'll have to move my screen a little bit. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was, as per von Ranke, the German historian who's often credited with pioneering the modern study of history through documents. Rather, it means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The danger affects both the content of the tradition and its receivers. The same threat hangs over both, that of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. In every era, the attempt must be made anew to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. Only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe if the enemy wins, and this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. Now, this is rather stark language coming from Benjamin, but what really strikes me about this is the idea that as we continue to tell ourselves the narratives about the past, there is a threat of making all of those who came before us agree with us. And one of the things that I find so interesting about the literature that I want to talk about today is that it presents a rather difficult set of views about a period of history that seems to be rather sewn up, especially as we move into another election cycle for both the US and India. But just to give you a brief timeline of the presence of Islam and Muslims on a political level in the South Asia region. Of course, Islam made it to what we'd think of as India today, well before anyone who was a Muslim was ruling any part of South Asia. We have evidence of Arab traders in Kerala and in Kutch, especially in the city of Bhadreshwar, which is sort of the famous city of Jagadu Shah of the Jagadu Charitra. And so Islam and Muslims have been part of the South Asia region for as long as there has been Islam. In the early 8th century, Muhammad bin Qasim controlled and conquered part of Sind, which is the first time that a region of what we'd think of today as South Asia was ruled by Arabs, which was brief. And fast forwarding a bit into the 11th century, when we have sort of a Central Asia region that was mostly various Turkish ethnicities who had converted to Islam and were building empires in Central Asia. Of course, in the early 11th century, we have Mahmud of Ghazni, who raids parts of North India several times, including most famously the 1026 sack of the Somanath temple in what is now Gujarat. But Muhammad of Ghazni was not interested in ruling over territory in what we'd think of as India today. And the first time that really happens is in 1192, when Muhammad of Ghor defeats the Tomars at a small place called Delhi. And this portion of North India becomes part of the Ghurid Empire, which doesn't last long, only about 14 years before his chief general Qutb al-Din Aibak breaks away from the Ghurids and establishes his own kingdom, which is really what we think of as the beginning of what we call the Delhi Sultanate. Now, for a timeline that matters a little bit more specifically to the Jains of Western India that we'll be talking about today, between 1297 and 1310, we have sort of the conquest of Western India, most of what we'd think of as Rajasthan and Gujarat today, by the Khaljis and Alauddin Khalji. And in 1320, the Khalji dynasty gives way to the Tughluqs, which is mostly the dynasty that I'll be talking about today. And even more specifically, Muhammad bin Tughluq is the second ruler within the Tughluq dynasty who reigns from 1325 to 1351. And it's in this period that the Kartargach monk named Jinaprabhasūri comes to his court in the years between 1328 and 1333. And that's mostly what we'll be focusing on today. After this, at the close of the 14th century, Amir Timur, otherwise sometimes known as Tamerlane, comes in and sacks the city of Delhi, which leads to the breakup of the Sultanate Empire, which was at the time larger than any other empire that had come before it, up until you have to go all the way back to Emperor Ashoka to find a larger empire in the South Asia region. And in that time, the intervening century, the 15th century, what we have in South Asia are a number of smaller regional sultanates, including the Bahmanids, the Gujarat Sultanate, and so forth. And a new empire starts to form in the 16th century that people are much more familiar with, the Mughal Empire. And it is in the period of 1555 to 1605 that Emperor Akbar reigns, who is much more better known for having relations with the Tapagach monk Hira Vijayasūri, but also met with Jinaprabhasūri the fourth, actually the sixth of his line, otherwise known as the Akbar Pratibodha, for having been able to instruct Emperor Akbar. But that's all about 2.5 centuries in the future from the period that I'll be talking about today. So just to give you a sense of the Delhi Sultanate's territory, At the height of its power, this was in about 1322 to 1330 or 31. And it covers most of what we'd think of as India, parts of what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh now. And to start our story here, we'll go to a small town that was then called Asinagar, which is modern day Hansi. And it's in Hansi that a chamatkari or miraculous image of Mahavira was plundered from a temple during an arrest of a number of the people of the town of Hansi by the local Sikdar, who remains nameless in our account. And this chamatkari image of Mahavira is taken from the temple there and is taken to Tughluqabad, the newly constructed fort in what is now the Merauli region. And this image of Mahavira is famous for having been able to portend for disasters for the local community. So as the story goes, it was once found to have been sweating right before an attack of a number of Rajputs. And it was also a favorite of alchemists for its ability to transmute mercury into other metals, particularly gold and silver, I think. This is not actually the image of the Chamatkari Mahavira. This is sort of a stand-in. The image is now in the Nogara Gali temple in Delhi. And if anyone has any connections to that temple, I would very much love to be able to publish and include a photograph of this Mahavira in the book. It's not too late. I think we could still sneak it in before the book is published. So please do get in touch with me. So as I mentioned, the image is taken to the Tughluqabad fort, which was newly constructed then. And it is one day during his sort of holding court that Muhammad bin Tughluq asks his local astrologer, who is the wisest person in the land? And the astrologer immediately names the Jain monk Jinaprabhasūri. And so the Sultan invites him to court and greets him with all due respect. And the two of them forge a relationship over a period of about a year, in which Muhammad bin Tughluq invites him and hosts Jinaprabhasūri at court. And it is during these interactions that Jinaprabhasūri so impresses the Sultan with some of his skills in debate, from which he remains victorious, emerges victorious, and in his ability to compose really ornate poetry that charms the Sultan. And it is during one of these interactions that Jinaprabhasūri asks for the image of Mahavir to be returned, which Muhammad bin Tughluq does. And as the story goes, after he has a good look at it, he returns it to the monk, where it is placed in a brand new sarai, Malika-Taj-Din Sarai in Delhi, in a new temple. And Muhammad bin Tughluq, as the story goes, reserves a quarter of that portion of the city for 400 Jain families. And of course, one of the big challenges of writing the history of the Delhi Sultanate is a lack of sort of corroborating or other evidence. So I often use imagery that comes from the Mughal period to sort of set our scene here. So this is actually a portion of a Vigyapti Patra, or an invitation scroll, that was painted in 1610 for the court of Emperor Jahangir. And here you can see the Jain monk being accompanied by a layman, a shravak, to obtain this here, this farman, for them to be able to go on pilgrimage. And so Jinaprabhasūri is sent from Delhi down to Daulatabad, Muhammad bin Tughluq's kind of second administrative center, that was otherwise known as Devagiri. And this is where Jinaprabhasūri spends the next about 2.5 years down here, helping, I guess, to establish a Jain presence there that links a trade route between Devagiri, Daulatabad, and Delhi. Now, I've discussed the issue of the destruction of temples and the reuse of their elements in mosque construction here, and I won't be talking about that very much today, but I do just want to signal it here. This is actually from nearby the mosque here, and we can see a portion of a Jain temple pillar that was reused there in the mosque. One of the recent pieces of evidence, or I guess not so, the piece itself isn't recent, but has recently come to light, is an imperial firman or an edict issued by Muhammad bin Tughluq to a community called the Sewras, which is exactly the same word that Abul Fazl uses for the Jains in his history, the Akbarnama, his history of Akbar. So this was actually issued in 1325. So it's not the very same firman that was issued to Jinaprabhasūri, which would have been in 1328 or 9. But it's very interesting that through the work of Zakir Hussain, that a very compelling case has been made for the authenticity of this document, which has been known for a long time, but has largely been passed off as a forgery. And I'll read just a portion of Hussein's translation of this. It says, the Sewaragan, or the plural of Sewras, which is possibly either Shwetambars or Shravaks, of Delhi, well known and reputed in their community, are great men and special disciples, which may mean that they follow a different path than the sort of customary of, say, Hindus, and well-wishers of the people and of His Majesty, the Sultan, so that wherever they reside, they should not be harassed or made to show a fresh pass. Indeed, they should be made happy with a kilat, a robe of honor, and an inam, or an award of some kind. So it's interesting that the very elements that we see here in this firman are some of the things that Jinaprabhasūri himself will talk about. Now, another one of the reasons why I brought up this this topic for this book is that as I was starting to do research on the medieval period of India's past, one of the things that I noticed was that there is a real narrative of cultural genocide that runs through so much Western scholarship on this period of time. And that has itself, of course, been influential on the way that many Indians have also written history, borrowing from the colonial past. And a lot of this has been shown in terms of the ways that, say, the history of India is told by its own historians, by Eliot and Dowson, sort of selectively translated pieces of Persian history to paint the period of Islamic rule in South Asia in a particularly negative light, and also to show that British rule was mild, as they pretty frequently put it in the prefaces to those volumes. But that has led itself to a certain way of speaking about this period of history without necessarily having to cite evidence as if it were just fact. And so one day when I was in my wife's office, my wife is also a scholar of South Asia, I pulled a random book off the shelf and opened it to a random page and was shocked to read this paragraph. It says, in 1318, the Muslim invader of Delhi captured the Hindu prince of Devagiri, flayed him alive, and set up his head at the gate of his own city. This event illustrates the cruelty and ruthlessness that accompanied the conquest of the Hindu south by Muslim forces from the north of India. And with the ascension of Muhammad bin Tughluq of Delhi in 1325, the massacre of Hindus and the destruction of Hindu culture increased. The threat of extinction of Hindu culture, religion, and law, yada, 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 she goes on. And yeah, this passage, right, I'm not sort of purposefully picking on Saskia Kirsenboom, but for a book that's about Devadasis in South India, this was a 100% unnecessary paragraph to write. She could have written her book entirely without mentioning anything about this event. And further, she provides absolutely no supporting evidence for any of what she presents here. And what I find so peculiar about this is that around the same time, I was also reading some Persian narratives about Muhammad bin Tughluq, particularly by a scholar named Badani. Zia al-Din Badani was not a big fan of Muhammad bin Tughluq, and this is one of his complaints about Muhammad bin Tughluq. In this, he writes, The Hindus are held in the greatest respect and esteem and are honored highly. The Sultan confers on them responsible offices, including governorships of provinces. He allows them to be furnished with the complete paraphernalia of greatness. Thus, the Hindus enjoy all luxuries, employing Muslims as their servants. They also carry on unrestrained and open propaganda of their books and disseminate their teachings, preferring Hindu philosophy to Islamic literature. Now, the contrast between these two is obvious. And what I find so interesting about this is that as we dig into what we think of as memory and what history does to memory, as we start to think about the ways that we have to cite evidence to support what we are claiming, the burden of trying to prove that this period of Islamic history was perhaps more complex than a contemporary narrative that is perpetuated both by many Indian historians as well as by many Western historians, is indeed due for a reconsideration, starts to come through with evidence like this. Now, it's complicating matters for us is that the sort of official narratives of the Delhi Sultanate don't mention sort of meeting Jains specifically, right? The Farman that we have that I just discussed is kind of the closest thing that we have to an official Sultanate document that makes clear that it understands who the Jains are and what they are up to. So, who is this figure Jinaprabhasūri? So he was the Acharya of the Laghu Shaka of the Kartargach, which was at the time the most numerous, prevalent, and powerful of the Shvetambara Gachas in north and western India. And so he was the Acharya of a branch of that lineage. He was a Srimala from Binmal, in what is now sort of southwestern Rajasthan. And he was probably the most prolific author of the late 13th and 14th centuries, certainly the most prolific Jain author. He wrote over 100 hymns and about 30 other works. And these include works on grammar and poetics, or chandas. He wrote a number of hymns that deploy sort of the alankaras that make them the sort of elements of kavya. He wrote a ritual manual, the Vidimarga Prabha, numerous hymns to goddesses, such as Padmavati, and a number of works on mantras, including the Vardhamana Vidya Kalpa, the Hrimkara Kalpa, and the Sūri Mantra Kalpa. But he is best known for a work that is today known as the Vividatirtha Kalpa, or chapters on various pilgrimage places, which I will abbreviate here as VTK. But Jinaprabha's own title for this work is the Kalpapradīpa, which I've translated as the light on the age. And we'll see by the end of my talk why I'm translating it that way. It's sort of a difference of deployments of the word kalpa here, whether it's chapters or the age itself. But some of the hints that we get when we read the narratives in the Vividatirtha Kalpa that include Jinaprabhasūri's interactions with Muhammad bin Tughluq give us some hints about why not only would he have been successful at court, but also why his narrative, his writing of the Vividatirtha Kalpa or the Kalpapradīpa would have been compelling to other Jains who would have been reading his work. So as the way Jinaprabha describes his first interaction with the Sultan, he talks about delivering an ashirvada, or a benediction, which he says he does in finely wrought verses. And then he explains it to the Sultan in a way that was so skilled and clever that the Sultan was exceedingly delighted and astonished. And the word that they use there is actually chamakarya. And so as I looked into Jinaprabhasūri's corpus, he actually composed a number of kavya works called chitrakavyas, which are image poems. And as he writes not just the poems, he also wrote a commentary on a work called the Vidagdha Mukhamandana, or the Ornament of the Mouths of the Learned, which is in a work that is completely about how to compose Chitrakavyas. And he points out in both some of the opening verses to his Chitrakavyas, as well as in this commentary, that this is an art form that is really meant for courtly performance. He mentions the context of the Goshti, which is actually the sort of the way that both poetic and religious debate would have occurred in courtly settings through these Goshtis or sabhas. And just here on the right, we have an image of a scroll that was used for training young poets in how to write various kavya forms in the chitras forms of Chitrakavya. So we have some of the laces here. This is called Murajabandha. We have the intertwining cobras here. We have various chakras. We also see pots and bells. Here we have a Nandyavarta. So a lot of different shapes that go into making these Chitrakavyas, but what it is actually is an oral performance. And so what you're doing when you compose a Chitrakavya verse is you're composing verses that have repeated syllables and patterns. And those repetitions are what the audience is listening for so that they can identify which chitra you are sort of expounding orally. So it's completely an oral art form rather than a visual one per se when it's done in the Goshti. And just to give you a couple of examples of this, we have close up and another. So the opening verse to Jinaprabha's lengthiest Chitrakavya poem, which is the Mahavira Stotra, reads, Chitrahi stoshe jinam viram, chitrakrita charitam muda, pratiloma anuloma adyai, kadgadyai, chati ati charubihi. Sorry, it's still a little early here. But it says, I will joyously praise the Jina Mahavira, whose deeds are astonishing, Chitrakrit, with extremely beautiful figures, Chitraihi, beginning with against and with the grain, Pratyanuloma Pada, and also the sword and the like. Now, I won't have time to illustrate for you all of the padas here, all of the chitras, but I just wanted to show one of my favorites here. And this is, this is the Pratiloma Anuloma Pada that they referred to here. It's verse 2. And here, each of the padas is a palindrome. It reads the same way forward and backward. So this is Vande Amundam Damam Devam, Yashamaya Yamashaya, Nayena Gaganayena, Pakrata Bamata Krapa. So the whole verse reads, I praise the Lord whose self-control is great, who is an abode of self-restraint for achieving equanimity. By that leader, egotism, thick with sin and without compassion, is destroyed. And here's my favorite. This is called the Sarvatobhadra, or the omnivalent palindrome verse. And this one comes to light if you stack up each of the quarters. And if you put each of the quarters sort of one on top of the next here, you start to see the repetitions both within the quarters. So it reads as a palindrome forward and backwards, but also reads vertically and in a circle here. So I'll just show you the verses also read around like this, forward, backwards, up, and down. And in case you're wondering what this reads as, it says, your wife, Surata, that is, preaching, beloved by the goddess Saraswati, is not barren in light of giving birth to the scriptures, which is the essence of truth. She is the foundation of your steadiness and firmness in the protection of the populace. So as clever as these verses are, clearly what it takes is a very deep knowledge of the Sanskrit lexicon, right? Certainly the lexicon, the chandas, the sort of metrics, grammar, right? So they're using very unusual words for some of our more commonly known figures here. And it's in that context here, before I move on, it's in this context that we can start to understand that Jinaprabhasūri was a monk who was trained to operate in these spaces, right? So he was well-versed in poetry and debate, and he was able to operate in the court. And so it's in this context that we can start to understand his work on the Vividatirthakalpa. And the Tirthakalpa is considered one of the prabandha texts, which was a fairly new genre in the early 14th century. And these tended to be collections of narratives about kings, famous poets, famous monks, and Jain laymen especially. And one of the things that distinguishes the prabandhas, say, from the other ways that Jains have written about sort of the great people of the past, is that these sort of self-consciously attend to figures who lived sort of closer in time to the author's own period. And in fact, in the 1305, most of these are in Sanskrit with some in Prakrit. And they are various levels of poetic rendering. Some are in prose, some are in verse. And so one of the interesting things about them is that the Kali Yuga remains one of the constant themes throughout many of these prabandhas, or in the Jain reckoning of time, the Dushamakala, our present fifth age. And in the 1305 Prabandha Chintamani of Acharya Merutunga, he kind of gives us kind of a brief definition of why these prabandhas seem to be necessary at the time. And so he writes in verse 5, because they have been heard ad nauseum, the old stories, the charitras, do not please the minds of the wise so much. So I, Merutunga, am composing the book, the Prabandha Chintamani, or the Wishing Stone of Narratives, with accounts of people who lived not so far from my own time. And so this really seems to be the marker of what makes the prabandhas, is that these are discussing figures who lived in sort of the recent past, not the figures, say, of like the Shalaka Purushas, right? The figures who lived in kind of the hoary past of time. And so they're, as Merutunga goes on to say, these are figures who can be emulated, and that their struggles are similar to our struggles because they lived in the same era of time that we did. So to show you sort of a timeline of the prabandhas, our figure here, the Vividatirthakalpa, is sort of smack in the middle of those. It appears in sort of 1333. The Prabandha Chintamani that I just discussed was in 1305. So these were composed sort of during and after the Khalji conquest of Gujarat. And all of these authors are connected with sort of southern Rajasthan and Gujarat, or those regions as we know them today. And a number of them follow on afterwards, including the 1336 Nabhinandana Jinodhara Prabandha of Kakasuri, the Upakesha Gacha, and I'll talk very briefly about that text here in a little bit. And then this genre is sort of fades off a little bit after that, but we still have a number of prabandhas that are composed in the 15th and even into the late 16th century. And I'll highlight just two of them here, the Upadesha Saptati of Somadharmagani, and the Panchashati Prabodha Prabandha Sambandha of Shubhashila Gani that appeared within 20 years of each other in the mid-15th century. Both of these were composed by Tapagach monks, and both of them include narratives of Jinaprabhasūri's relationship with the Tughluq Sultan, although the character changes from Muhammad bin Tughluq to Firuz Shah, his successor. And it's very interesting that Firuz Shah also sponsored the first Sanskrit work on the astrolabe, which is called the Yantra Raja. And it was actually a Jain monk named Mahendrasuri who composed this work, clearly working with scholars fluent in Arabic and Persian to translate work from Arabic and Persian into Sanskrit. But what's interesting about these two works is that they reflect on Jinaprabhasūri's story and his interactions with Muhammad bin Tughluq as a way of thinking about their own ascension to power. In the 15th century, the Tapagach was becoming ascendant, especially in Gujarat. And as they were thinking about what the proper relationship is between an acharya or a leading monk of a lineage and the Muslim ruler of the area, in this case, in the 15th century, would have been of the Gujarat Sultanate. And then later into the 16th century with Akbar, that Jinaprabhasūri's story was kind of the boilerplate on which their reflections on what it meant for a monk to interact with a sultan we're starting from. Okay. So to talk a little bit about the Vividatirtha Kalpa, it has 63 chapters covering 48 different tirthas or pilgrimage places and cities around, especially in Western India, North India. About 2/3 of it is in Prakrit with 1/3 in Sanskrit. And it was composed between 1308 and 1333. And it blends both sort of eulogies and poems of praise about these various sites, along with some of the historical events. And I'll show you just one example of that. But this incorporates some of these holy mountains like Ashtapada and Girnar and Shatrunjay, along with cities like Palodi, Merta, of course, Patan on Ahilwad. And it tells us about the figures, the monks and laymen, the kings of those places, but also the gods who preside over them. And as well, also the history of alchemy is kind of embedded into this text as well. Certainly things that my colleague Lina Danani has started to look into as well. And as I mentioned, he calls it the Kalpapradīpa, or the light of the age. And many of the chapters in this text talk about the efforts that Jinaprabhasūri undertakes along with local Jain communities to counteract the effects of the Kali Yuga, or the Dushamakala, and that he continues to show that through communities coming together to restore images and temples, that this actually is leading to a new era of prosperity for the Jains, capped off, of course, by the protections that Muhammad bin Tughluq has issued to Jinaprabhasūri on behalf of the whole community. And so these are the firmans that he acquires. And what's interesting about this is we also see how the entire sacred geography of the Jain tradition is being reimagined. So in the Prabandha Chintamani, the text that I just talked about a little bit ago, and composed in 1305, it tells the story of the brothers Vastupala and Tejpala going on pilgrimage from Patan, which was then the capital of the Chalukya Vaghela Empire, going via Shankeshwar and Stambatirtha or Cambay to some of the major pilgrimage sites of Gujarat, right? Shatrunjay, Girnar, and then the Dilwara temples of Mount Abu, where they build the new temple, the Luna Vasai there. But this is really, in most of the geography of the period, this is kind of the sacred geography of the Jain tradition. And in the Vividatirtha Kalpa, it expands across much of North India here. So you've got, of course, Gujarat, Rajasthan, as well as the Doab, the Ganga Yamuna region, well discussed, as well as Devagiri here, Daulatabad, and some adjoining sites here that speak to the long past of Jain presence in those regions, but also it's sort of a reconnection of this part of the Jain sacred geography here that had otherwise just been isolated to Western India prior to the unification of much of India under the Sultanate map. And if we compare this, here, just give you a sense of some of the sites here. If we compare this to the Delhi Sultanate map, we can kind of see a nice overlay here. There's Daulatabad or Devagiri here, Delhi here, Junagadh, Gujarat here. So let's pick up our story again. Before we do that, let's take a look at what the VTK says about Shatrunjay. This is actually the first chapter of the text. And it draws on a number of sources that come before it, including the Situnja Kapo in Prakrit of Dharmaghosha-sūri, and several Tirthamala and Chaitya-paripati stotras. The earliest one being the Sakala Tirtha Stotra, which actually names Shatrunjay as the third most important Jain Tirtha after Ashtapada and Samit Shikar. It gets a promotion between then and the 14th century and becomes actually part of a wider revival of Shatrunjay in this period. And as he says here, there is 100 times as much merit in installing an image as in doing worship or puja, 1,000 times in building a temple, and endless times in maintaining or restoring a temple. Here it's a palana, or protecting a temple. And one of the terms that we see frequently used in the Tirtha Kalpa is udhara, really literally lifting up or drawing out. Sometimes used in Jain history to talk about either rebuilding or renovating temples, but also for establishing new images, and even for reforms in the monastic system are often described as udharas, or sort of raising up. And so this becomes a key trope in the Tirtha Kalpa for reform and restoration as key ideas. And included in with this, he also mentions the key event at Shatrunjay. In verses 119 and 20, he writes, Tik, Phi. In 1313, the image established by Javadi, a great Shravak of old, was broken by the Mlechas due to the power of the Kali Yuga. And in 1315, the good Samara Shah restored Udharita, the main image. And it's actually, this account here is actually told at length in one of the earliest texts in Maru Gujara, or Old Gujarati, by Ambadevasūri, called the Sangapati Samara Simha Ras, which was actually composed for the restoration ceremonies here, which John Court has recently talked about. And what's very interesting about the Shatrunjay Kalpa is that it concludes with this verse. It says, in undertaking this for him, the king, the Rajadiraja, has shown favor to the community, the Sangha. And so from this victory, this Kalpa should forever be known as the grace of the king, or the Raja Prasada. So here we get a hint that as this was composed in 1329, just a year after Jinaprabha's initial meetings with Muhammad bin Tughluq, that this is in fact the Rajadiraja that he is talking about here, and remembering in here a favor shown to the community. Now, I think time is wearing on a little bit here, so I will fast forward here to the end of our story. But just to mention that very briefly here, in the Nandana Jinodhara Prabandha, which was composed just 3 years after Jinaprabhasūri's death by the Upakeshagach monk Kakasuri, narrates at length both the destruction and the restoration of Shatrunjay, which is a partnership between Samara Shah and Alp Khan, the local governor under the Khaljis of Gujarat. And also mentions the pilgrimage that Jinaprabhasūri conducts from Delhi to Hastinapur. It's actually kind of the last official act that he does that we know about. So in 1331 or 2, Jinaprabhasūri returns to Delhi at the Sultan's invitation, where he had been in Daulatabad the previous 3 years. And a junior monk in his lineage tells so-called the rest of the story here for us. And in this section, we learn that Muhammad bin Tughluq establishes a new Jain quarter called the Bhatarika Sarai, complete with a new Upashray or Poshadashala, and a new temple in which the Mahavir that had been returned to the community 3 years prior is then reinstalled. And it's interesting in that this section, Vidyatilaka, is really interested in showing how Jinaprabhasūri should be considered the Yuga Pradhana, or the leading monk of his age. And in fact, he makes an equivalence between the Sultan and the Sūri, the Jinaprabha, where he calls the Sultan the Siri Savabhoma, or the Sri Sarvabhuma, right? The blessed Lord of the whole world. Where Jinaprabhasūri is called in that same line, the Sūri Savabhoma, or the Lord of all monks. And he mentions the firmans that Muhammad bin Tughluq issued to him, to Jinaprabha, and saying that the Shwetambaras and the Digambaras travel in every corner of the realm without any trouble, holding in their hands the edicts, or the Puramana, given by the emperor. And so, yeah. And to conclude here, both Jinaprabhasūri and Vidyatilaka mention that Muhammad Shah is working in the elevation of the Jain faith, or the prabhavana of the Jain faith. In Jinaprabhasūri's own account of his meetings with Muhammad Shah, or Muhammad bin Tughluq, he says, having witnessed the elevation of the faith done by Sri Muhammad Shah Sahi, even though it is the fifth age, right, the Dushma Kala, people carry on as if it were the fourth age, or the Dushma Shushma Kala. Right, of course, the fourth age is a period in which almost all of the Jinas lived. So he's saying that this is actually returning the Jain community to the status that it had under Mahavir himself, in a way. In Vidyatilaka's closing remarks end up echoing quite a bit those of Zia al-Din Barani that we saw at the beginning of the this talk here. He says, just as when the Hindus ruled, as in the fourth age, so in the fifth age, during the rule of non-Aryans, monks go about freely spreading the teachings of the Jinas. And that is it. All right. And I will close here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vose. Your lecture actually threw light upon many interesting things. Do we have any questions from the audience before I start asking? Professor Vose, have you read this text, Ardha Kathanak, by Pandit Banarsi Das?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. He mentions many things about his getting in touch with Akbar and the other emperors.
Right. Yes. He mentions, I think, Jahangir's passing, and yeah, I was quite traumatized by the event. And
Yes.
yeah, of course, we have, some other texts from that period, the Bhanu Chandra Gani Charitra. It tells a lot about the interactions with, Hira Vijay Suri and Akbar. I was actually just reading the Mantri Karma Chandra Vamshavali Prabandha, which is a story of a minister to Raja Rai Singh Rathod, who was one of the main generals of Akbar's army. And so this is a Jain minister who was, it's actually the progenitor of the Bachawats Gotra, who was was a very capable minister for the Rajput kings who served under Akbar. Yeah.
We have a few questions. Sunita Manian, Dr. Manian, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. That was amazing. I'm already trying to figure out how to bring you to my campus so you can speak here as well. I'm at Georgia College and State University. Thank you for an amazing talk. I had a quick question, and I couldn't keep up with my notes as quickly as you were speaking. So
Sorry.
when you, as somebody who works on gender, this was something that piqued my curiosity. When you were quoting from the Sarvato Bhadra, and you mentioned, a quote about your wife, beloved of Saraswati, is not barren. Who was it speaking to? Who was the recipient of this?
Yeah, who is Saraswati's husband here, in a sense. Yeah, just to show everyone that verse here. Yeah, so this is a hymn of praise to Mahavira. So yeah, this is actually Mahavira's wife, Surata. which, yeah, actually I had some help translating this one here. Yeah. This figure here is, the idea is that a muni or a monk of any kind is sort of married to his renunciation in the sense. And so, yeah, the idea, there's a play on words here that it's surata, right? So one that is sort of, yeah, very beautiful, but is also sort of well spoken as well. So yeah, but yeah, I'd be happy to come and talk in your class in any capacity that we can manage here.
Thank you, Dr. Manian. May I ask Mr. Shaleen Jain to ask his question?
Very good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Steve. It was really interesting listening to you. I was just wondering one thing. Nowadays, histories of religious syncretism, they are being less talked about, and rather they are seen as problematic proposition in South Asian public milieu, both at the level of theory and practice, and more so when clouds of majoritarianism are looming large. So do you think that the shifting political exigencies and the histories of violence being talked about nowadays, it requires to be put on a larger canvas, as has been done by Francesca Orsini and Samira Sheikh in their work after Timur left? And you also have been doing so, and we are eagerly looking for your work from such a longevity perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. That's a great question. I would say that, yeah, this is one of the ways that a critique of kind of religious identities has been kind of appropriated in ways that perhaps those who put forth those theories had not intended. But I think the criticism of syncretism is sort of the presumption that religions start off as pure things and are then later sort of amalgamated with each other, right? This is, Jain studies is kind of plagued by the idea of, say, whether bhakti is sort of original to Jainism or whether it's borrowing from Hinduism, right? I would say earlier generations of scholars presumed that what is really authentic about Jainism is its ascetic path and that there's no room for bhakti in that. And I think, you know, the work of my mentor, John Court, who I saw is tuned in here, of course, has really disrupted that idea both historically and conceptually. And I think it's a really important intervention that has been very influential on my work. And when it comes to, say, interventions that the historical record shows, I think one of the things that my project was trying to do that I didn't see a lot of efforts being made, even among historians who were trying to complicate the picture of what was going on in medieval India between local religious communities, local Indian religious communities, and Muslim rulers, was a sense of what did people who were alive at the time actually have to say about these interactions. And so it's fairly unique that Jains wrote a lot about their interactions with the Sultans, later with the Mughals, and that listening to their perspectives and taking them seriously is a way that we can really complicate the idea that this was a pitched battle between religions that were sort of dead set opposed to one another. And that rather what we have are moments of realpolitik that certainly were painful and nobody enjoyed, like having their temples destroyed. But these weren't the kind of religious animus gestures that they were, that if we put these in larger context, we understand that, right, it wasn't every single temple that was subject to being destroyed. It was temples that were affiliated with political power, which actually, if we take that thesis seriously from Eton, I think it actually shows us how much political power Jains actually had, even if they weren't kings. And that being, yeah, sort of aware of not just the history of this period, but putting in an even broader context of these are things that Hindu kings did to one another. And that, yeah, certainly understanding that some of the events that get portrayed as sort of charged as with religious animus are actually sort of the world of politics. and that it was actually possible for Muslims in India to disagree with one another, as Badani certainly was no fan of Muhammad bin Tughluq. It's possible that Muhammad bin Tughluq forged very strong alliances with Hindus. In fact, Samara Shah, as we learn about in the Nabinandana Jinodhara Prabandha, was appointed governor of Tilang or Telangana province, who had a similar office to the one that Alp Khan held in Gujarat here under the Khaljis. So it's a very complex history that when you start digging into the source material here really shows us a more complex world, and one that doesn't neatly fit into certain kinds of narratives that we are hearing about these days. So yeah, thank you for that question, Shalin.
Okay, thank you. I think Mr. Bansal wants to ask a question.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Stephen, you mentioned about the use of unusual words in the palindrome and how it becomes slightly difficult to derive meaning out of that. So, my question relates to that aspect, that how words in Sanskrit, or for that matter in Prakrit, can have varying degree of meanings, which at times can also mean, completely opposite meanings to what someone is used to. Now, this becomes
Right.
slightly difficult, actually very difficult for a researcher, and I guess you can tell from your experience, or anyone else for that matter who has worked with manuscripts. So how would you say one should go about reading these, because words and use of unusual words and how meaning is derived can actually alter the narrative. And
Yeah.
it becomes particularly difficult in case of Prakrit, because how Prakrit is learned nowadays is through Sanskrit. I mean, one cannot learn Prakrit in its own right in India. So, the meaning comes from Sanskrit, and one cannot know the original meaning of what it meant in Prakrit. So, this unusual words and the meaning aspect, I'm curious about what your views are on that aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Keshav. So yeah, as a historian, my facility with Sanskrit and Prakrit are what I consider to be ready and competent. So I rely on working with other scholars who are much more expert in Sanskrit grammar than I am. And so I worked with people like David Bhakta and some other folks who helped me translate some of these words, and really getting deep into the lexicon and grammar actually helps us to see how words can be coined. And so, yeah, if I have to say, if I had to do it all over again, I would have gotten much deeper into Sanskrit grammar as part of my studies, for sure. And I would encourage all of those of you who are in the audience who are students to really do as much work on grammar as you can. It's the foundation of every work of philosophy. And it's the foundation of all works of poetry as well. So being able to sort of work with the principles of Sanskrit grammar to derive meaning from the words that we see in works of kavya like this is essential, absolutely. And of course, the other part of this is what happens when these words go into Prakrit. That Prakrit lexicons are, as you say, sort of, they presume a knowledge of Sanskrit. And that may not always be the most helpful interpretive lens. And so we do our best working with a very, I would say, a kind of a historical compendium approach to Prakrit, and that what we have to do is find attestations in as wide a breadth of literature as possible. And so being able to work with everything from a work like Vadaruchi's grammar all the way to, the kinds of narrative literature that I studied, right? There's a host of works there that give us attestations of meanings, that give us a probabilistic understanding of what these texts likely do mean, right? I have to sort of rely on the idea that this is some measure of scientific method in the sense that my interpretations are probabilistic rather than definite, and that they are falsifiable with further evidence. So yeah, let that not trouble you. Just offer your interpretations. If someone comes along with better evidence at a later point, thank them for contributing to our knowledge. So thanks,
Thank
Keshav.
you. Do we have any more questions? Dr. Pandey, do you want to ask anything?
Yes, so first I would like to thank Professor Steve for this excellent talk. I am a student of philosophy, so my perspective may be different. So I believe in theory of ahimsa anekanta and aparigraha. So from my perspective, actually, you told, you presented Tughlaq as patron of Jainism through your last slide.
Mhm.
So being a student of philosophy, my question is that I think nobody will accept to be ruled by a person who came only to rule on. Number one. Number two, when he came to India, and I am well aware that you have visited it's just near Tughlaqabad, Qutub Minar,
Hmm.
and you must have seen the ruins of Jains and Hindu temples over there. And everything was actually happened before Tughlaq came to India.
Hmm.
And his capital was just very, I will say that I think maximum 4 or 5 kilometer distance from that. So yes, I agree based on the evidences that he had a very good relation, particularly with, I will take like this. He had a very good relation with Jinaprabhasūri only.
Hmm.
On the basis of that few evidences, and on the other hand, you can see the ruins of Jain temples and Hindu temples just only 4 to 5 kilometers far from there.
Hmm.
How can we say that he was a patron of Jain tradition?
Well, there's a few ways to answer that. One, Muhammad bin Tughluq was born in India. He was the first actual ruler in India. I mean, within the Delhi Sultanate, he was born in India, along with Amir Khusro, who's part of that generation. Yeah. Two, the temples that Muhammad bin Tughluq destroyed and was responsible for destroying, that Phil Wagner and Dick Eaton sort of profiled in the Deccan and other things, were clearly part of practices of conquest. And that, right, the effort to, say, build a mosque using the pieces that came from temples didn't necessarily have the same kind of cultural meaning in the 14th or 13th century that it does today, right? That we don't have concepts of cultural patrimony that are the way that we tend to translate the meaning of those acts. Certainly, right, there were people who weren't terribly happy about having their temples destroyed to have a mosque built over them, right? The act had to have been an event that was sort of establishing rule. But what it wasn't was something that was A, out of the ordinary for things that, say, Hindu kings did to one another, or B, that Jains themselves participated in at different points in times as generals and as ministers to those kings. And so having that kind of view of history, I think, helps to kind of diffuse some of the ways that we have talked about in more recent historiography, talked about what the meanings of those acts are. I mean, certainly when we look at a figure like Alauddin Khalji, right, he had enough of an understanding of the realpolitik of the region that in this conquest of Gujarat, right, part of what he was doing was trying to build an empire that was going to be an administrative state. So he was trying to establish bureaucrats in those regions. And that was a different style of rule than had come prior to him, in which they were trying to plunder in order to feed a large standing army to keep the Mongols out. And so Alauddin Khalji was building an empire as an administrative apparatus that was trying to do something different for supporting an army of over 130,000 soldiers, whose chief job was to keep the Mongols out of South Asia. And so when we think of it in those terms, like, what do you need to do those kinds of things? Alauddin Khalji's answer to that was to introduce price controls, which works great for farmers and consumers, but not so much for the merchants who have to move those goods from the fields to the cities. So when Muhammad bin Tughluq came into power, he did a very different thing to try to do a similar outcome, which was he established a token currency. Token currency works great for merchants. And so, right, his economic policies, like we see, right, from the perspective of kind of colonial historiography, right, Muhammad bin Tughluq seems insane, right? He tried to establish a second capital. He introduced token currency, right? Almost all of the people we have record of him executing are actually other Muslims, who are people who were not on board with his project. And so, in fact, Saskia Kusambum is flat wrong when she says that he was responsible for massacring Hindus. Right, certainly all of his law and order was projected at the old guard of Central Asian Turks who were Sunni Muslims who saw Delhi as the Qutb al-Islam, or the last bastion of Islam, as this bulwark against the Mongol horde of Central Asia. And the Tughlaqs were not well liked by those elites who thought that a different party should have taken over for the Khaljis. And so Muhammad bin Tughluq was trying to do something quite different by establishing close relationships with Hindus and Jains to sort of cut out some of these old elites who didn't like him. So, yeah, were these events painful? Absolutely. Did they precipitate a major political transition in North India? And that sort of made its way southward over the course of the 14th century? Absolutely. But, right, what it necessarily wasn't was a battle of, say, Hindus and Jains versus Muslims, right? Because first of all, the people who were serving in the Tughlaq armies and the Khalji armies were all sorts of folks, plenty of Hindus to be found in those armies. At all levels, from pikes all the way up to generals. You also have disaffected Mongol generals who defected over to the Sultanate side. And so it's a very complex world. And one of the things that we can really do to dismantle the idea of being ruled by a foreigner is to also dismantle the very idea that India was an integral nation sort of in waiting to become a state. That what we actually have in this period are various kingdoms and regions that understand each other as sort of practicing some of the same religious traditions. But that's no different than, say, like France and Germany being both like Catholic countries that were plenty at war with each other for most of their history too. So I think those are some of the ways we can have a more complex picture of this past. And by reading the Jain sources alongside Persian and Arabic sources, we actually do get a view of what people who were not just part of those courts were thinking and feeling at the time. So yeah, thanks for that, Shinant.
Yes, thank you. Actually, my interest of field is not history, but it depends on what is the objective to rule. So we have so many things, but it will take time based on philosophical ground. How can we justify to be ruled by someone else? But yes, thank you again.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's certainly what they say the Rathod Rajputs thought about the Chauhan Rajputs too. So yeah.
Yeah.
I see we have
Alright.
2 more hands.
Yeah, Dr. Jain.
Hello.
Yes, hello.
Yeah, good evening, Professor Bose. You recall we met at Jaipur in 2014
I do, yeah.
at IGS
Yes.
classes, and even with
Yeah, I do,
Delhi
yes.
and Ajmer and Delhi also. You purchased
Yes,
so many
yes.
books in Mutla Rashidas. So I am happy. It was a very pleasant. That time we have more discussion with you. I have a simple question. At New Delhi, we listen, but I didn't find any story about the our Pratmani Yoga scripture about Muslim emperor Aurangzeb, about that he has allotted a land of peace for preparation of a Jain temple in front of his fort. So that is you have acquainted for that stories. Please.
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely followed your question. I think you broke up a little bit. Yeah, I heard about Aurangzeb at the end, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I think we'll
Right,
take
Professor
Period
Khan.
the time,
yeah, the
let
last.
Dr. Ashok Singh, summarize the talk now.
Pragya ji,
Because
please
time is,
invite Professor Janikar.
Yes, yes.
Okay, good
Support
morning,
her.
all. I hope can you hear me okay?
Yes,
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 John.
perfectly.
Okay, good morning from a very snowy and cold Midwest. I just wanted, in terms of Sri Netra's question, to add a little bit to what Steve was saying. And this is stuff Steve and I have shared together. You look at actually the Khalji conquest of Gujarat just a couple decades before Jinaprabhasūri, and it's quite clear that almost every single one of the temples, which we have evidence that it was destroyed, was actually supported by kings and had been built by kings, both Jain and Hindu temples. And one of the things that happens when you have a change in rulership in the medieval time is the temples lose their financial base, because all of them had endowed lands which supported the temples. And actually during the Vagelas, and here I'm talking Gujarat, they'd already started losing their financial base. So it may well be that a number of the temples that were used to provide materials for building subsequent, whether it be palaces or mosques or whatever, were actually either abandoned or largely unused. It seems, and again, this is echoing what Steve said and Dick Eaton, that temple destruction was aimed at structures that were built by previous kings and were associated with the legitimacy of their rule. And if a king can't support the temples, then he is delegitimated. So again, it's much more a political act. And again, just looking at Gujarat, we have evidence of continuity of community-run temples right through the change of rulership. It's the royally sponsored temples that tend to be used as resources for future construction. So it's echoing Steve. It's a much more complex situation than some kind of a black-white, Hindu on one side, Hindu Jain on one side, Muslim on the other narrative would allow us to see. So thanks again, Steve. Great talk.
Oh, thank you, John. Yeah, and just to sort of echo your paper on the Samara Simha Ras, the sort of the early Maru Gujara work, that he portrays Patan under the Khaljis as a flourishing city, and that's So certainly none of the Jain temples in Patan itself were sort of subject to this kind of plunder or destruction. So yeah, very interesting and complex. And also we'll say that Jinaprabhasūri, who is the acharya of the Brihat Gacha, part of the Kartar Gacha, sort of the of course he's the third Dada Gurudev. He also got a firman from actually Ghiyas-ud-Din Tughluq, the first Tughluq ruler to go on pilgrimage. And so, yeah, there's a lot more documentation that is sort of offhandedly referred to. And so the documents and the texts that I've looked at as sort of constructing a literary memory of this event are actually part of a wider kind of constellation of documents that sort of give us brief snippets and references to these periods. Of course, the great Thakur Peru, the Kartargach Shravak, was the mint master to Alauddin Khalji, wrote a number of works on coin billons and gem assaying and things like that. So yeah, we have a very complex world here of multilinguistic compositions that were working in the service of this empire.
Such an interesting topic. We cannot stop talking about it. I think there is a lot of things to discuss. I'll have to discourage Dr. Mehta and Dr. Srivastava. And we shall move to our chair, Dr. Ashok Kumar Singh, to listen to his views. Yes, definitely. Thank you for your email ID. We can send our questions over there.
Yes, please.
Good evening, everybody. I am thankful to our authorities for giving me opportunities to preside this prestigious lecture by Dr. Vose. Dr. Vose began his
lecture with the survey of the first interaction of Muslim in form of Arab traders to India, and he gave the timeline of the rulers of the Sultanate dynasty. There were 5 dynasties which ruled India, beginning from Ghulam dynasty established in 1206 to 1526 by the Lodi dynasty. He focused his lecture on Jinaprabhasūri and give minute details about his works and his interaction with Muhammad Tughluq. He also gave some instances of the hostility of devastating the idol of the Jinnah established by Jawali. His abstract and the title gave us impression that he will talk of the Jain prominent persons as well as Jain acharyas of the whole Sultanate age, and all the literary sources which deal with the such content. But he confined himself to the Jinaprabhasūri and Muhammad bin Tughluq, and we see that he also tends to establish that the Muslim rulers in general and Sultanate rulers were not hostile to the Jain community. When we see the literary sources and inscriptions of the Jain related with the Jain and interaction with the Sultans, we find that it includes pilgrimage, installation of idols, building and renovation of Jain temples, and interaction of Jain acharyas with the Muslim rulers. And it also gives description of the devastation of the idols, seizure of the city, and atrocities carried out by Muslim soldiers and Muslim forces. We find that the interaction of the Jain community was mainly with the Khilji dynasty and Tughlaq dynasty, and with the with exception the Sikandar Waqt of the Sikandar Lodi of the Lodi dynasty. And Khilji, the account begins with that of the Alauddin Khilji, which had Thakkam, as he mentioned, as the master mint of in his state, and he has invited Digambar Acharya Madhav Sen to his capital, and he also invited and honored Svetambaracharyas, Jinaprabhasūri, and some other acharyas. What I will like to tell here in brief, that there are certain evidences when the Sultans were hostile to the Jain community. Though the first instance we get that there was a celebration at Jalore by the Jain community. The Muslim soldiers seized the whole city, and as this was as hostile act. Then we also find that there were the Khatargach Gurwavli also mentions the military campaigns of the Sultanate Vose and its evil consequences. Then the description of the atrocities or the difficulties faced by the pilgrims, Jain pilgrims, are also depicted in Jain sources. So, and the first thing, which is foremost, that to obtain permission for each and every religious activity which was done by the Jain community and Jain acharyas, is this indifferent attitude or favorable attitude towards the community? They can't take even a pilgrimage, they can't celebrate their religious functions. So I think this is enough to prove that it was not so, the atmosphere was not conducive for religious activities. There are evidences that if a pilgrimage was to be taken by the Jain prominent person of the society, he had to take permission and farman issued to the regional rulers and district officers to protect them. So to protection from whom? It means that the regional officers and the soldiers were hostile to such activities, and Sultan had to intervene there. So, and one thing I will like to include to the information, that there is a prabandha by Rajsekhar Sūri Prabandh Kos, which gives a detailed account of interaction of Vastupal with Muḥammad bin Tughluq. It is stated there that the mother of Muḥammad bin Tughluq came for Hajj pilgrimage. Vastupal took to his home and hosted for 10 days and accompanied to her to hold the Hajj pilgrimage, and she took him to the Muḥammad bin Tughluq and introduced him as his second son, and Vastupal got favor for the rocks of the Manmad mines, which was very famous for the marbles. And this incident, I think, also gives interaction of the Jain royal personages with the sultans. So I think, there are so many sources like Khardar Kacha Brihad Gurwavali and Prachin Jain Lake Sangrah by Jin Vijay, and some modern works like Jain Community and Sultanate by Pushp Prasad, and the new inscriptions of Sultanate age, which must be consulted for the true picture of the Jain interaction, the interaction of Jain community with the sultans. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Thank you so much. I think there are many pieces to put together, and I really wish someone invent a time machine now. So to conclude the session and to have a formal vote of thanks, I would request Dr. Vose, are you trying to say something?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to ask, which Vastupala are you talking about? Vastupala, of Vastupala and Tejpal died decades before Muhammad bin Tughluq was even born. Not only that, but Vastupala as a minister actually aided one of the Hajj pilgrimages that came through Gujarat on its way to the Hijaz. So I'm not quite clear about which Vastupala you're talking about here. Yeah, I mean, I also did consult the Kartargach Gurvavali. Obviously, my talk ran as long as it did. I didn't have time to discuss that, and I discussed Pushpa Prasad's work in my book. But yeah, so we also have records of pilgrimages happening during the conquest. There's actually a pilgrimage that happened from Kembe to Girnar, and in the Kartargach Gurvavali, it explicitly states that the pilgrims could hear the battle going on the other side of Girnar mountain. When they were in Saurashtra. So like clearly they didn't find that it was too dangerous for them to go on pilgrimage. Pilgrimage involves security. It also involves going through territory. So if you're going to go on pilgrimage from Delhi to Shatranjay, like you need to make sure that somebody is going to be there to protect you along the way. So making sure that you have informed the local political authorities is actually sort of standard practice. So to say that this is because the Muslims per se were hostile to them is completely inaccurate. What you're actually talking about is an administrative state that is like making sure that security is actually being handled and that people are moving through space, paying their taxes or not, as accordingly. So like to say that this is about sort of Muslim hostility to Jains is actually inaccurate.
All right. As I said, there are many pieces to put together. I think we should conclude the lecture here, and I would request Dr. Shugan Jain, to our president, to come ahead and say a few words in the end.
Thank you, Pragya. Today's lecture was indeed very revealing in the sense that Steve has tried to document some of the interactions that the Tughlaq had with Jain Acharyas. So, we read in the books a lot of things, and he has tried to document it through real, handwritings and other manuscripts, And the most important thing that I liked, Steve, about you was some of the very detailed things, the farmans, like, how he gave the, like the Pehchan Patra or the identity cards to the Jains so that they can move freely, within the community. And also, I think the basis of all what you see is that Jains have been a very, focused, religious, business-oriented community. And our research has shown that they have been, for ages, they have been associated with the kings because they have been the suppliers of finances, jewelry, and other precious things which the kings like. So there had been a good interaction between the Jains and the kings, sultans. So I think this was very good. I will not say that this is the whole thing, but you focused on one aspect of Tughlaq and Yashovijay. So which is, very very informative. Otherwise, you can go to Qutub Minar and, the place you visited, Dadabadi, and see how the Jains, interacted there. So subject is very wise, and I thank you for your focus. It was very interesting. And I thank all the participants, especially I was very happy to see John Cott, come up and provide detailed support to the presentation that you made. And our Shalin Jain, who is an expert in this subject, and he has published very good books. So I thank all of you for making this lecture a truly successful and a very good beginning for the New Year series of lectures. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Shubhanji. We have many, many eminent personalities over here today. I thank you all for coming. Dr. Pandey is saying something. All right. So thank you so much. We will announce the next lecture soon. Stay tuned. Jai Jinendra.